Chuck Gormley, former Flyers beat writer, also covered the Washington Capitals. He's now doing some work with the NHL Network, ESPN.com, where he writes about the MVP of the All-Star Game, Wayne Simmonds. And it's interesting that Wayne Simmonds having a season to remember, MVP of the All-Star Game, kind of a breakout season, Chuck. And you look at Wayne Simmonds, you know, are the Flyers getting a guy that they really didn't anticipating, obviously, in that deal? But are they getting a guy now that maybe is more than they thought they already had, as he developed into that next level type of player for them, more so than just a role player that many viewed him as?
Yeah, I think he's become Mike Richards even better. When Mike Richards was a young player, I think a lot of people compared him to someone like Bobby Clark, a guy who just gave it every night. But I think as his time in Philadelphia kind of drew to a close, it was becoming clear that he wouldn't be that player. And I talked with Dean Lombardi about this last week when he traded Wayne Simmonds. He knew this could happen, but at that time, he wasn't getting any power play time. He was killing some penalties. He's a third-line guy, maybe a fourth-line guy at times. So I don't think Dean Lombardi thought this was going to happen, and the Flyers have benefited from it. It's going to turn out to be a very one-way, one-sided trade, but I'm sure, like Dean Lombardi told me, they needed a player like Mike Richards to teach them how to win, and he did with 2 Stanley Cups. So I think it's one of those win-win trades, but right now I think the Flyers are happy with the way things have turned out because Wayne Simmonds can do it all. I mean, I got to see him from a distance in Washington, but this year has been a real treat because he can play in every aspect of the game and at a very, very high level.
Chuck Gormley with us here, talking Flyers hockey and talking Wayne Simmonds. And Chuck, you really did your homework too. If you could relate that story about Wayne Simmonds and Lombardi's wife to our listeners.
Yeah, it's funny because I called Dean Lombardi and he said, I'm a busy guy, but anytime you want to talk about Wayne Simmonds, I'm all ears and I'm all mouth. And he told me a story about how when the Flyers went to LA this season, they came in on the bus and they were getting off the bus at the arena, and Wayne Simmonds walked right up to Dean Lombardi's wife, Wanda May, and he said to her, Wanda, I'll never forget what you did for me. And Wanda said, what did I do for you? And he said, when I was young, I was without a contract. I didn't have a car, and you loaned me your car. And she broke down in tears, and she told her husband the same story. And he told me that he remembers looking out of the window of the practice facility and seeing Wayne Simmonds in the parking lot. He slept overnight just so he could get in to do some workouts and show them that he was a serious player. So that's a great story about just the kind of dedication that he's put into his career. As a young kid, he didn't have a lot, and, the community rallied around him to buy him equipment, to pay for tournaments for him to play in, and it's all paid off. And what's ironic is that he wins a car as MVP over the weekend, and of course, he says he's going to donate it to a family member or a friend or charity.
Talking with Chuck Gormley here. The Flyers take on the Carolina Hurricanes tonight on 97.3 ESPN. But speaking, of Wayne Simmonds, kind of a guy that, some people, as you wrote in the piece, that some people thought he was the worst pick in that draft. Is that something that has kind of drove him to, to where he is today?
Yeah, I think he was a 61st pick overall, and he wasn't on anybody's draft list. He was actually an overage junior, so he had been passed by every team in the first round and was about to be passed by every team in the second round. And, the reason he was drafted was because the guy who had him in junior hockey at Owen Sound had been hired by the LA Kings as their director of amateur scouting. So if not for him, who knows? I mean, if that director of amateur scouting had stayed in junior hockey, he may have never been drafted. So, it's funny, but I've always been convinced that if you're good enough, they'll find you. And sometimes guys go undrafted. I mean, Adam Oates went undrafted and he's a Hall of Famer. So if you're good enough and you have the drive, people will find you. And I think no matter where he was drafted, Wayne Simmonds was going to make it to the NHL.
Chuck, what was his, he's been in Philly now, so he is a Flyer, but when he got traded, he's a young kid. I guess he's kind of a secondary player in that deal. What was it like, for him to go back to L.A. And realizing, man, I got traded from here, that whole, recreating that whole situation for him and going there as an All-Star had to be pretty interesting and surreal.
Yeah, he was really happy about it. I remember I talked to him earlier this season about the Olympics, about whether players would really want to go in 2018. And he said, "Why are you asking me that question? I'm not an Olympian." But he's that close. I mean, I think he is an Olympian. I think if they did go to the Olympics in 2018, he'd be right there. And, it's funny, I talked with Brayden Schenn about how he felt when he was traded on that same day. And I think he was the guy who was the key to that deal for the Flyers. It's funny, you go back to that trade that the Flyers made with John Leclair and Eric Desjardins. Desjardins was the key to that trade. And Clark said, hey, why don't we try putting John Leclair with Eric Lindros? And, of course, we saw what happened. But sometimes that happens in a trade. You're looking for one key player, but you think that there might be another piece that you can grow and you can turn into an offensive player. And Wayne Simmonds was very similar to John Leclair. He came as a checking line guy, and he's developed into, a world-class player.
Chuck Gormley with us, 28 years of covering professional hockey. And, Chuck, you mentioned Brayden Schenn, 15 goals, 18 assists for him. Has he become the Brayden Schenn that the Flyers hoped they were getting, or is he still a work in progress?
I covered that series last year between the Flyers and Capitals. I thought he was the best player on the ice for about 3 or 4 games before he was injured, and then he took a whack at one of the Capitals. I don't remember which one. But yeah, I think Brayden Schenn can be a dominant player. The knock against him is that he hasn't been able to do it on a consistent basis. But I think he's a playoff-type player, and if he can continue developing, I think he's a solid second-line center, and that's what they hoped that they were getting. And if you can put him behind Claude Giroux as a second-line center, I'm okay with that. And Sean Couturier is your third-line center down the middle. That's a strong middle of the ice right there, and I think he is getting better every year, and he's a veteran now. I mean, he's a guy who should be putting up big numbers, and if he does, this team has a chance to get into the playoffs, and who knows, they could maybe win a round.
Let's talk about the playoffs a little bit. And 32 games left now. At this point last season, Flyers were on the outside looking in. Of course, they went into the All-Star break this year, holding on to that final wild card spot. Do you think this is a playoff team? And if so, what do they need to improve on to guarantee that they get into that postseason?
Well, they have to stay healthy for sure. I mean, that's always a key. But, yeah, I look at the standings. I see Ottawa with 58 points, Boston with 56, Toronto with 55, and, of course, the Flyers are with 56. And I think because Boston has played 5 more games than Ottawa and Toronto, and because they've played 2 more games than the Flyers, I think Boston is the team that falls out of that picture. And I see Ottawa getting in, Toronto getting in, and the Flyers getting in. And, I just think goaltending to me has been the real key this season. It has not been their strongest suit, and when it's good, they can win, but it hasn't been good enough long enough this season. So that to me is the real. I think if you look at what they have up front, I'm okay with that. I don't think they're going to make any big deals before the trade deadline just to get into the playoffs. I think Ron Hextall sees this as a long-term project, and he sees players on the back end that he can bring up next year and have a solid blue line for the next 5-6 years. But I don't think they're there yet. I think that they're kind of have a patchwork defense, and you kind of get what you get when you have guys that are not high-quality NHL defensemen, and that's why I think they've been inconsistent and why their goaltending has not looked as strong as it probably should.
Yeah, stop us where you've heard that before with the Flyers. Goaltending issues. Mason Neuvert, we'll see which way they go over the final 32 here. And, of course, a lot of young players set to come up at some point. They got a lot of young guys on this team. We'll see what these final 32 games look like. But Wayne Simmonds, the MVP of the All-Star game, has really turned the corner as a Flyer as that trade many years ago.
It's a win-win.
As Chuck, you mentioned
sides.
at the beginning, he turned into Mike Richards. He was the guy that that they hoped they had with Mike Richards, and they traded him away, and they got a guy back in Wayne Simmonds. Check it out at ESPN.com. Thanks, Chuck.
Hey, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.